Welcome to Conversations to Inspire. I'm your host, Kim Adams, and I'm hoping that these conversations will inspire you to take a chance, make a change, follow your dream, and find your groove. So today I'm very excited to have as my guest Samara Bay. Now, Samara is a dialect coach and has worked with many Hollywood movie stars in their movies, working with their dialects and accent and how they speak, and also worked with women who might be running for public office or who are needing to pitch their idea and be seen as capable and confident and find their own voice. But most recently, Samara has written a book called Permission to Speak, which I have thoroughly enjoyed because for me, it takes the voice and talking about being who you are beyond the 3D and just really wraps it up in terms of psychology and sociology and culture and the impact that has on how we speak and how we are seen by others. So welcome, Samara.
Thank you. I love that intro. Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
it is such a full view of the voice. And I used to do some executive coaching with women who
Mm.
worked in very masculine organizations, such as policing, which is where I used to work. And it was I look back now and how I adhered to the very typical, looking at tone, looking at body size, taking up space, all that sort of thing. But your book really does wrap it around in much more of a nuanced way in how we look at the voice. And you talk about the term a voice story, that we have a voice story. So what does that mean?
Yeah, thank you for telling us about your background in executive presence work, and specifically what it is to adhere to this masculine standard, and even to a narrow definition of a masculine standard, right? If any men are listening, or if we can think of any men in our lives who don't fit the alpha male narrative, they probably are struggling with that standard as well. The thing I hit on in coaching not just actors, but then women who are running for office for the 2018 midterm elections in the US, which were a huge deal because we were 2 years into that dude's presidency and trying to change the narrative in the country. And then ultimately working with entrepreneurs and now working in corporate spaces. What ends up happening is that we get to / have to reckon with the stories that we have all been conditioned to believe about what a professional voice, what a leader, what an authority figure is supposed to sound like. And this runs deep, right? Because you can say, like, knee jerk, yeah, but like, I have to sound like that or I'm not going to get taken seriously. And you know what? In some rooms, you may be right, but I'm here for what happens at the end of that sentence after the but. Like, but what if the way that the world is going suggests that leadership isn't actually working out so well? There's a lot of broken institutions. And what if there's like a fundamental change in what leadership is meant to sound like, which affects who is actually in charge in tiny ways and in big? And then actually thinking about our own misconceptions about how we need to sort of come across in high stakes moments is actually at the heart of that shift. If we actually get really granular and think, have I always, my whole life, been worried that I say and too much, or that I say like too much, or that I go up at the end of my sentences and I know I'm supposed to go down, or that I'm too roundabout when I should be direct, right? These shoulds. Again, some of them are, perhaps good advice, right? Like maybe you say enough that it's distracting for your listener and that it's telling of something that you're trying to hide, and it's a different way of being in the world that is asking you to, less. But maybe not. Maybe you just say about as much as humans do. Like linguists are brilliant at actually, notating the ums in a regular conversation. Ums have a purpose. They tell the listener, I'm gathering my second half of my thought, stick with me. And then the listener takes that and understands that it means exactly that. The listener doesn't necessarily think, oh God, she's saying so much, I'll never take her seriously. So obviously that's one small example, but inside of that is just a world of ways in which we discount ourselves before the world does.
Yes, I can
And
really relate to
right, like
that.
what the like massive like life destiny ramifications are for each of us is just like gets me every time.
Yeah, yeah, I can so relate to that. The stories we tell ourselves about our voice. I grew up in far north Queensland, which is, I guess, the same version of the deep south in the US.
Mm.
Very hot, very humid, very laid back. We tend to be lazy speakers. I never really thought much of it until I moved when I was about 30 to a southern capital city, which has a very English influence in the city and how they speak. And I went into this role where I was really ambitious. I was really keen to, be seen as competent, probably already second guessing myself as the girl from the country, to have my accent made fun of in how I spoke. And I'd never thought about it before until it was pointed out to me. And I think that had a huge impact then on how I started to moderate my own voice.
So, you asked me specifically what a voice story is, and I kind of answered a sideways answer, but what you just offered all of us very, very graciously is an example of a voice story, right? We all have them. And it's
Yep.
connected to our literal story, right? Where you grew up, what some of the sounds were that were coming out of your mouth, how everybody sounded around you. But it's also all the psychological stuff layered on, right? How and when you left, for any of us, right? How and when we left home,
Mm.
what our feelings were about being seen as other when we landed somewhere new. Were we proud of our heritage? Were we sort of, rubbing up against stereotypes? Maybe both things are true at the same time, right? And then what we did next. What we
Yes.
did next of it all, what we did to get by in rooms of power, as I like to put it, right? So maybe it's going off for college, maybe it's your first job, maybe it's dating somebody, maybe, it's running for office. I mean, the idea of suddenly being seen by a different group of people who doesn't already know everything about you, which is really my definition of public speaking, by the way. It's like really broad. just talking to anybody who doesn't already know everything about you. Um, and all the little micro adjustments that we make because we can tell, ooh, when I talk like this, it makes somebody lean in. Ooh, when I talk like this, I get the impression that they think I'm smart and not stupid. Okay, well, I have that capacity to talk like that. Like I could do that. And then, perhaps we reach a moment when we're like, but what's my real voice?
Mm. Mm.
And it's not that there is one, right? I think that's actually a misunderstanding. Like your authentic voice is only one way and everything else is fake. I think that's a complicated way to try to live. But I will say that question is juicy, right? Because sometimes
Mm.
we've picked up habits to get by in rooms of power that then become us. Maybe it's unlocked a part of us. Now I know how to come across as smart or tough or whatever. And I like that about me, for example, but maybe not. And this is where we get to actually take ownership of our own voice and be like, you know what, that habit I picked up of going up at the end of the sentence or of asking, do you know what I mean? I picked that up in that room when I didn't have any power at all. Now I have a little bit more power. What if I just, with a little bit of mischief, a little bit of curiosity, try to
Yeah.
end a few sentences differently today and just see it, just pick
Yeah.
up some data. Like, so now what happens?
It's interesting because I think that's part of what I did. I started to cultivate a more confident voice or a more serious voice, if that makes sense. And after a while, a lot of the feedback I would get from people later on in my career was, "You're always so confident and calm." Meanwhile, on the inside, I was paddling like a duck. And then it almost becomes that circular thing that happens. Well, people think I'm confident, so I must be okay. I must be good. So that starts to reinforce that new voice. And then do we give ourselves a little permission, or do we need to be given some permission to allow that just to be sometimes, like to not
Mm,
force that?
mm.
Mm.
It's interesting, right? I mean, the answer is different for everybody. And what I'm really interested in underneath that question, I think it sort of lives inside of that question, is what feels good, like on the
Mm.
inside. What feels like there's some joy present or some alignment, like the version of you with
Yeah.
your friends, with your favorite people. It maybe doesn't. doesn't feel like that version of you fits 100% in your big pitch meeting, but maybe more percent than you are currently thinking. Because that version of us around friends, when we're with friends, we have nothing to prove. Good friends. And that version of us who has nothing to prove is free. And permission is another way of saying freedom. And free us is just so exciting. The version of us that's free, that's telling a story, and it doesn't even have to be like a good story. It could be like I just ran into this friend at the grocery store and I haven't seen them since the pandemic and they look totally different. And oh my God, the conversation. But those kind of stories that we share with a friend, like what version of that is you? What version of you is that? Who is that? A leader? Is that somebody who's just talking because they care and alive with a story of a wild moment? And having nothing to prove means that we're not sort of hiding.
And and I'm just reflecting on some of the leaders that I've seen, or whether that's politicians or, for example, in policing here in the state I live, recently in the last few years, we've had our first female police commissioner. So that's the highest level, in charge of about 17,000 people, staff. So we're quite large, our police services over here. And it's the first time a female has been in charge. And she is also from far north Queensland and has a very relaxed way of speaking. And I think she was judged initially for that. But at the same time, she came across as very warm and connecting and normal, not the typical smooth talking quasi politician that, police commissioners somewhat need to be. So it was interesting. I've been watching her transform the way she speaks over the last few years to becoming more polished, but she's definitely retained that more casual way of speaking.
It makes me think of, chapter 4 of my book is on tone, and specifically on this really interesting dance between two very different energies, strength and warmth.
Yes.
And, for any of you who are watching this, right, notice what like archetypes or stereotypes come to mind as soon as I say that, right? Because often those stereotypes are what's holding us back from fully embracing our own version of those energies, right? So strength is our I've got this vibe, right? It is confidence. But confidence can't really be looked at straight on. Confidence is a byproduct of something else. It's a byproduct of not hiding, actually. And trusting that you belong in the space. How you bring your belonging with you, right? That's the work. Not like seeming confident, which will seem puffed up and fake and not actually do what you wanted to do.
And that we can see from a mile away. We can
right?
see,
I mean, that's what I mean. It won't do what you wanted to do because exactly, it like breaks trust instead of building trust.
Yes.
So the strength side of things for all of us is part belief, right? I actually do believe that I am, that what I have to say matters, or that I've got this. And part is exploring for each of ourselves what version of strength has turned us off to trying to seem strong. If we don't ever want to come across as, I don't know, some like stereotypical, perhaps more masculine, mean, tough, violent, vain,
is that why women tend to be more apologetic in how they speak? Because I've been preparing for this interview, I've been reflecting on my own approach to voice over the years, and in those circumstances where I wanted to be seen as part of the boys sitting at the table of management, but at the same time not wanting to make them feel less than, which is just so sad that we even get to that point. So
but it's real, but it's a skill we've all got. Well, I don't know. So the other part of it is warmth. And I think that may be what you're getting at. So, the warmth side of things, if the strength side is I've got this, the warmth side is I've got you. The warmth is how much, if we have a dial from 1 to 10, which we don't, we're humans, not machines, but just as a metaphor. 1 is I'm closed, I'm not available. And that comes across as cold, right? And 10 is I'm warm, I am entirely available, and I am also reaching into my reserves of love to take care of you. regardless of whether or not you've earned that, which can bring up resentment, right? Sometimes we're like, this room of people does not deserve me taking care of them. But that, right? And that's fair. And the provocation is, right? And as a strategy, bringing a massive amount of warmth to a space where you want to get heard will help. And so the question is this dance of strength and warmth. We all can probably think of somebody who has way more of one than the other. And then we do get into this example is what you just gave us, right? Where if we're all warm and no strength, oh, I'm not totally sure if this is a good idea, but I just wanted to offer it. But if you have a better idea, like totally just let me know, right? All completely understandable. We're trying to do that in order to be unintimidating. It probably worked in certain rooms of power, right? So, okay. But without the strength of, I've got a really good idea. Let me know if it works for you, right? So strength and warmth together, it can get a little lost under all of the apology. But the opposite is a not very helpful sort of other version of lopsided, right? If you're all strength, I've got a great idea, but you're quite cold, also hard to be heard.
And people immediately put up that barrier then, I don't want to listen, or she's a bitch, or they think they know all that.
We've got a whole bunch of words in English language for that. Exactly.
You have a quote which I'm not sure whether it was from the book or whether I was listening to an interview, but I wrote it down some time ago, and it was, power sounds so many different ways, and it can even sound like me. And that just really hit home for me, because I think so many of us don't think that that's me, like that doesn't sound like me, I can never be like that.
Yeah.
And I love that idea that it can sound like me.
And it can sound like you the way you actually sound.
Mm.
And the more that we believe this, the more it opens up some version of ourselves that does give ourselves permission, that does allow us to share our best, weirdest ideas. And we do change the world from where we are. With that, not every room, right? There's no accounting for taste. But I think it's actually a movement to decide that how I sound is how power sounds. And, an early inspiration for me, before I even had the idea of a book or a podcast or anything that's happened since then, is I was watching a TED Talk, and it was Jane Goodall, the woman who, lived with apes
The gorillas
for many years.
Yep.
Yeah. Who's a scientist. And I grew up with a dad who's a scientist and grew up going to physics conferences. So I know a bit about like the science community and what's considered like safe ways of communicating in public in order to not quote unquote lose credibility, which I know is just a heavy phrase in the academic world and the science world. And then here was Jane Goodall, Dr. Jane Goodall, doing a TED Talk where she just was soft, quite honestly, and humanist in this way where she's just like in love with humanity and misty like I'm getting now. And yet unapologetic, and yet also an authority figure who the world recognizes as such. And I think this little tiny seed was planted watching her, that there are actually so many examples of the new sound of power, as I call it, all around us. We just have to notice. And then we have to notice our bias around it, right? Is that what a scientist is allowed to sound like? Well, she's doing it. So yeah, let's decide yeah. And if we decide yeah, and if our friends do, and if our kids do, we're changing the world.
Do you think social media, and now that people who could never have been on TV, for example, but they now have their own channel, so they now have their own platform for a voice, is starting to help us see more different versions of people who are successful or who are celebrity or who are powerful?
I mean, it's such a good question. I open it up to all of you who are watching as well, right? That's the question, right? I mean, I think the answer is yes, but I also think like we are literally the ones deciding that. Like we're not just observing the culture, we actually are the culture. It's wild, right? We forget that. We like abdicate that power. But each of us is in your case, right? In my case, content creators making, but also we're consuming and we're deciding. I mean, literally, for you, for me, and for every one of you watching, what do you notice that you want to share? What do you notice that you don't want to share? Like, what is your body, not even your intellectual mind, that's probably saying right now, but I have to sound this way if I want to get taken seriously in that room with the blah, 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 right? Not your mind, but your body is like, well, boring speeches don't go viral. If somebody has something really interesting to say, but they are not willing to show up like a human to say it, I don't trust them. I'm not going to share it.
I think that's probably impacting then on our willingness to accept authority figures, because we now are questioning things more, whereas before there was nothing to compare against.
Oh, that's so juicy, because it's like, I mean, in certain ways, when we can't trust authority figures, it feels like life is suddenly chaos. That is probably part of what we are experiencing now internationally everywhere, with the amount of feeling a sense of chaos. And the plus side, the other side of that is, if the old standard of, if you have a deep voice, I mean, whether or not you're a man, if you have a deep voice, you're very stoic, you don't show any emotion, you're very measured with your tone, so everything that you say sounds like it has been pre-planned. You can come up with, any of us can come up with a few more. I like to say, Google, how do I sound more authoritative? Google will tell you 5 things. It's literally what I just said, plus like, seem confident in your body.
Yes.
And don't go up at the end of your sentences. You have to go down. Like, absolutely nothing is open for debate. So, if we are all sort of beginning to notice, whether or not we're putting words to it or we're just feeling it in our body, that no longer, when we hear somebody talking like that, it no longer means 100% they'd actually make a good leader. That's both terrifying and a huge opportunity.
Exactly. It's terrifying, because then who do I look to? But then if we're willing to open our minds and look over here, there are so many people who can step up and now who might have the opportunity.
That's exactly right. This is the heart of my real impetus with this book. It's 2 things. It's a how-to guide, right? I like to say a how-to guide and a love letter to anybody about to open their mouth. And it is zooming out and talking about this big cultural story of what power has traditionally sounded like, and asking all of ourselves this very juicy question around, well, what might power sound like in a better world? What kind of leadership would we rather have? How do we be that today?
And that really links in, because I guess my hope with this podcast and what I talk about, and part of what I've been trying to do for myself, I think for many years, is finding my groove. Like, what is it that makes me me? Who is it that I want to be? Who is it that I am? Who is it that I want to be? And how can I get there and allow that vulnerability to come out? Because I think, well, for myself and for many people, we have this persona, which is a good thing. We need to be able to wear different masks at different times, but it can get confusing sometimes. What is the mask and what is me? So unpacking what I sound like, and what will I sound like if I start to change is an interesting question for me.
Or if I just start to orient toward joy. And I don't mean joy like big gales of laughter, although obviously very into. But I mean something that just feels whole, something that feels whole. I think the presence of joy is usually a sign that we feel whole, or that we feel like we're in alignment, like we're in the right place at the right time doing something that we want to do. It's hard to feel joyful in a scenario where you don't feel that way. So then it's like, if it's not, I can Google in order to find out how to be authoritative, but rather I can like bring a sense of love and joy and care into high stakes spaces. That really changes the game of what your whole orientation is, right? And also, just to say this, because we haven't quite said this on the nose yet, another way of talking about this is that this is a social justice lens on public speaking. So for any of us who have felt like, because we're women, because we're people of color, because we have an accent that is coded in our culture for fill in the blank, right? Stupid, lower class, whatever. For anyone who has ever felt like they sound different, we know in our bones that something has to give, and that we're being kept out of power positions by other people, but also maybe by ourselves, in terms of how we decide that a powerful person is supposed to sound. So even just grappling with these is already making the world more diverse. I mean, making those of us who might hold back not.
I think you say in the book there was research that showed that we can judge or make a discrepancy around someone's socio-economic status within 7 words of them speaking, or something similar to that. And that really blew me away, because I thought, wow, that's pretty intense, and that does really show that the social justice influence of speech, of the voice, of how we feel behind our voice
Yes,
impacts our whole trajectory in life, really.
Totally. And that's in a section that really gets into, a lot of social scientists' studies around this, right? I reference a bunch of people that aren't me who did the work. I did the work of curating it and finding them and being like, this needs to be mainstream, like now, right? And yes, one of the things that I was curious about and researched is there are, as we know, many ways in which both the hiring process for jobs, but also like the loan process at banks or the house buying process has certain rules that are meant to stop discrimination from happening. Do those rules work, is its own question. But none of them, not a single one of those institutions I just mentioned, has anything around how people sound. Voice bias, accent bias is just invisible and not policed.
And it was something I'd never really thought about before, I guess. So if we are wanting to add on to our voice story, because I don't think we can change it because the story has already happened, but it's there. It's we
next
can't
chapter.
just
Time to
take
write
it
the
off.
next.
So how can we more consciously maybe add to our voice story, if that's something we should be doing, to then move on to the next version or the more expressed version of ourselves?
Whether you just listen to this conversation or pick up the book, I think the answer in that really lies in each of you. I think part of what is profound about what I found with this topic is that what we're really doing is noticing the ways that our society, that, big eons of cultural trends like the concept of patriarchy has played with us, has left its mark. And the alternative is not to cast away all those shoulds and fill them with new ones from someone like me, but rather to actually claim what you love about how you sound, what you've always wanted to maybe play with, shift, leave behind, and to do so, as I say, from an orientation of joy or of love. Knowing that the process of doing that might be quiet on the inside of you, but is actually like a revolution. It's actually a radical act. I mean, as an example, me, right? I mean, I'm basically a year into a book tour now, which takes various forms and is, whatever I sort of want it to be at this point, right? I've been traveling a lot. I've been speaking in big rooms on big stages, but I also do these that feel much more intimate and honestly my favorite thing in life, like having chats with people, like on my favorite subject. What do we sign me up? But on purpose, I have decided to try to model every single chance I have some version of the new sound of power, right? This new sound is necessarily diverse. I'm obviously not saying now everybody please sound like me, but I am saying that the version of me that you're getting is the version that is giving myself actual permission to sound like the life I've actually lived, which for me meant growing up in Northern California, spending a decade on the East Coast for college and grad school, going to 2 different Ivy League schools. So learning how to sort of sound like the type of person who, knows how to raise their hand and say something clever in a room, but also a theater kid who just cares about like humans breathing together in space and having big feelings. And all of that is present. And my weirdness, I think, is probably totally obvious. And by weirdness, what I mean is any of us, when we actually just embrace the idiosyncrasies of our actual lived experience and how it comes out and how we sound. And my sense of humor. And I've kept this pretty unsweary, but like sometimes I swear.
Sometimes.
And, this is deliberate. It's not deliberate like I'm manipulating myself or my listeners, but it's deliberate that I'm not managing myself out of having a personality because of some old-fashioned and even in my own head voice that says, but what would you do to get taken seriously? I've decided no. I'm at the point in my own career where I have enough power, let's just call it, to spend it how I want. And one of the ways that I want to spend it is to show up as authentically as possible, orient towards my own joy and delight and mischief and love, and be unapologetic about it, be.
I love that. And I think for me, the idea that I'm trying to get into more of a habit of having in my life is to stop the self-monitoring, because I feel that that's what I've done all my life, is self-monitoring everything that comes out of my mouth. How is that going to be received? How am I going to be perceived? Is that going to get me what I want?
Yeah.
Is it not? Have I said the wrong thing in the wrong tone? What will they think of me? Is constant self-monitoring. And for me, I think that's the biggest thing I'm trying to shift.
I'm just like, I wish we were in a big group right now, but I'm assuming that those of you who are watching afterwards are having a moment, and I'd love you to like write in the comments so we can see it later.
Yes.
If that feels real for you, because what you just so beautifully described, Kim, I think is the human experience, possibly the woman's experience, but it's so real. And I think what's so essential, and I just want to say here, because normally I would have said it by now, but we had a really delightfully like free form conversation, is there's a lot of shame that comes up around our own relationship to our voice. I have my own story I tell in the introduction of the book, right, about losing my voice for a number of months in my 20s. I wasn't sick, didn't know what was going on, and ultimately got my way out of it by, hiring a speech pathologist. But the shame of self-sabotage, why did I do this to myself? That took much longer. And in a way, this book is the one I wished I'd had in my early 20s. I didn't know. So as we notice our own habits and our own lifelong inner voice about our voice, let's also invest in like an anti-shame campaign here. That is the way to be radical about it. The way that in which, let me put that better, the way in which we talk to ourselves feels tiny, but is actually radical. If we are loving to ourselves as we're like, that habit was interesting. Why did I pick that up? Well, it's certainly, right, for you, it certainly worked in that room. Micromanaging my responses has served me well. That is a thing we can all notice and love on and go, wow, humans are so resilient. I am so resilient. Look at how each of us has evolved, like in these tiny little ways, in order to be just what that room needed, so it wouldn't kick us out of the tribe on some, like fundamental evolutionary level. Look what we did. And look what we can do, right? And especially if we know that there's a collective of us, that there are thousands, millions of us around the world who are looking for the opportunity to bring something that feels a little closer to us, a little closer to delight, into our high stakes moments. And maybe, by the way, in our lower stakes moments, in our office politics, we let ourselves off the hook. All right, I'll just talk to this way to Bob because it makes things go smoother. Like, I'm not here to police our every movement moment, whatever. I'm not here for that. I'm here for like, when the stakes are high, it's usually when we're talking about something close to our heart, where getting a yes will change our life. We'll change our kids' life. We'll change our friends' life. We'll change our community's life.
No pressure.
Right? But that's the thing. That pressure makes all of those dormant, quiet little voices that say, surely they can't handle the real you.
Throat, I think our throat chakra, all that energy just sucks in.
So this conversation and this book is about arming ourselves so that when those moments happen, when our real destiny is on the line, our real opportunity, our real yeses, we don't just think, oh, the pressure, and go into the most Heidi version of ourselves possible, which we know is just waiting in the wings, wanting us to do that, right? Our ego, don't rock the boat, don't mess with the status quo.
Don't be too different.
Don't be too different.
But
what
only
if
a
they
little
can't
bit.
handle me? Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Stand out.
Exactly.
Stand up.
Stand out because of my
bit.
personal brand, but not in a way that would get me in trouble. I know. In fact, there's this tiny, tiny little moment in what is it? I think like chapter 2-ish around this little whisper of get in trouble.
Mm.
It's like, I'm not saying burn down your house and lose your job and lose everyone you've ever met and loved.
Don't tell your boss to stick it where the sun doesn't shine.
Right? Unless you're willing to handle the consequences.
Yes.
Totally. Yeah. If it's a strategic move, I am so here for it. But I am saying that in those moments when somebody says, oh, you have a side project? What are you up to? If you hear that little voice in your head that I'm offering now, that very, very lovingly says, get in trouble. Just a little bit. And it makes you actually say what you're working on with a tiny bit more of the actual care you have for it rather than hiding the care. A different response will happen.
Yeah. This book could have been Permission to Be You is really what the book is about. And I love that, having spoken to groups and run workshops on executive presence in the past. I cringe a little bit after reading this book because this is just opening it up about not having that stereotypical, like you say, these are the 5 things that you do to be seen and heard, but it opens it up and really says your voice is your voice. And to me, there's also that element of choice. You get to choose when you want to switch on your authoritative voice or your work voice. You can choose. You don't have to.
Even I might say it more like your sort of brave voice. Right?
Voice.
I like to talk about this because I feel like it feels very relevant to me as somebody who's been more of a public figure this year than ever before.
Mm.
But the bravery muscle is allowed to take breaks and to show up. Mm. And especially for any of you who are listening who know you have an upcoming opportunity to pitch your idea or to present something that's close to your heart. Using those opportunities to work on being a little braver, to bring a little of your mischief into those spaces is what will make the impact. And we have this cultural, assumption that that's the opposite. That room can't handle me. I better play it safe. And so the bravery is to push beyond that to something that feels just more whole, more human, more spirited, and to remind yourself and thus everybody who is listening that we're all humans. We're all like meat sacks with dreams, all of us, whether we live our lives that way or not. But when we step into that, when we have the opportunity to step into that, we lift the vibration of everyone around us and they remember that they are meat sacks with dreams and the world becomes better right where we are.
I think that's the perfect way to wrap up this interview, is we're giving people permission to be who they are, to take that little step, maybe that little bit more bravery, that little bit more voice, and just get out there and be themselves. And I must say, every time I have done that, it always gets reflected back in a positive way. When you truly just step into your own, you're not trying to pretend something, but you are being that little bit of a braver version of yourself. It works. Yep.
I'm glad to hear it. I feel this way too.
Well, thank you so much, Samara. I really do appreciate you taking the time to speak with me and to everyone that's listening. So, permission to speak, where can people find that? I imagine on the usual online
Oh,
places or
yes. Hold on.
website.
I'm going off for a moment. But for anybody who's local where you are or in the UK, this is the UK version.
Mm-hmm.
It's available anywhere. It's available on Amazon. The audiobook I
Yes.
personally recommend. I did the speaking.
I will also
Um,
recommend the audio book. I have been
I was
listening
going to
to
say, I
that.
hear it's really good.
Oh my God, she sounds
um,
just like herself.
oh, what a dream. I love that. Um, yeah. And then, if anybody wants to be in touch with me, I'm over on Instagram and I have a newsletter if you want to go to smartbay.com.
I will leave
And
those
also
links in
comments
the
here.
yeah, definitely. I'll leave the links to Instagram website in the show notes. Yeah, and please comment what really stood out for you, or was maybe a little of a aha moment when you realized that was something that you would like to become more aware of, or maybe where you'd like to step into your bravery. So thank you, Samara.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.